Hello, I'm Greg. Welcome back to our journey now through images and the interpretation of imagery. And it begins, of course, for our species, presumably in the imagery of dreams. This is before even any art takes place, or even perhaps before the alteration of the body, scarification and tattoo, and various other kinds of augmentations that we might associate with people living in what we've come to call the social contract kind of society, the most basic society that we know historically. And we began last time and we talked a little bit about dreams and how they would interact with the real world, and perhaps that these earliest cave paintings were an expression or projection of imagery that people actually dreamt, and their purpose is still somewhat mysterious. It's been long associated with sympathetic magic and the idea that one is hoping and to manipulate some kind of force upon the side of culture over against nature. And yet, this seems perhaps a little bit too discrete, a little too binary, a little too structuralist. And so let's try to dig into it a little bit more in this part two of image, the mythic imagery of dream and vision. Dreams can, of course, occur to us as quite real whilst asleep, and even sometimes vivid enough upon awakening. In their more profound insight, they convince us that dreaming can itself be thought of as a kind of thinking. It is as if they have their own genius about them, one aberrant to certain norms, and as well, one seemingly oft aloof to the common sense of the day. We have all remembered some of our dreams. Apparently, the vast majority of them we do not remember upon awakening. And we've all been awoken because of action in a dream sequence, especially if it's a frightening sequence of some kind, or grotesque, or one that has a pointed message for us, either to do with our anxieties, our concerns, our cares of the waking hours, and they get translated in some metaphoric vision that is very personal and very intimate. And yet, of course, there are patterns to dream imagery. We'll come back to that in a moment. This genius of the dream is perhaps kindred with that of the artist, or if yet beyond this, one that speaks a language approaching that of the translucent redaction associated with that of the gods themselves, the Traumdeutung, the dream meaning, available to us only upon waking, and as well reflecting analytically upon the content of the dream. Here, it is sage to know that by far most dreams are not at all recalled by the waking self, putting both the Victorian idea that religion was itself sourced in the dreams of primordial humanity, as well as, if we cleave to any such related idea, that our sample size is woefully thin to make such an argument, which left by itself would remain within the mysterious temple writ small. That we refer to part of our skull using this very term, the temple, is oddly fitting, given that we too are acolytes of our own unconscious, in receipt of messages, at first obscure and even occluded. This is just like someone making a pilgrimage to an ancient temple, hearing the voice of the priestess or whoever is charged with translating the message of the gods from the oracle, and then you're having to interpret this. We talked about this, of course, when we were working through the object of text. We talked about Themistocles famously interpreting the Delphic oracles build wooden walls, referring to the lack of an Athenian navy. And so there's a sense that within our heads there is an oracle of sorts, right? It's almost as if there's another voice, that of the unconscious, speaking its own language that has to be somehow understood, interpreted, and translated by the waking self, the conscious self. And just as it requires an interpretive effort to discern the meaning, thence the meaningfulness of this of the oracle, so too then does this apply to dreams, as we just said? And though there is dialogue in most dreams, in which we find ourselves speaking, rather as does the acolyte, naively or expectantly on the one hand, arrogantly, or at the least overconfidently on the other. Our main role as ourselves, if you will, is to listen to what others are telling us, right? We're in the dreamscape, there is action, there's people talking, we meet different characters, and we listen to what they have to say. And everything in a dreamscape has a metaphoric quality to it, right? We're not to take our waking lives, we're not to take anything about the dream too literally. These others, what are they? As projections of aspects of selfhood, okay, on the one hand, letting us in on insights that our conscious mind is generally too busy to note. Or, if in the case of these others standing in figuratively for actual others in the waking world, they are then communicating what we ourselves imagine subconsciously these others think of us, or what they mean to us in terms of how they enable or augment our character. The first is, of course, lens perception that may be lent some further contour by a dream sequence, even if it remains and must remain a projective quality. But the second is more authentic to our self-perception. Yet whatever insights we may or may not be gleaning from this internal oracle, the hermeneutic point is that we must engage with ourselves as perceivers as well as actors. We are thus brought face to face with the reality of subjectivity, for lack of a more precise term. We find that subjectivity is at once a function of intersubjectivity, okay, our relations with others, in that we gain a social identity through interacting with others, and objectivity, in that we are beings in the world. The apex of this dialectic can be called simply self-image. So we're back once again to this concept, which is not text, not world, not music, but rather image. Interpreting imagery then requires us to look both past both projection and transference alike. The one, because we are, almost by default, prone to seeing ourselves in everything around us, just as there is a penchant for seeing faces or the like in anonymous landforms or clouds, etc. Early translation software used character recognition as its device, for example. Well, we can usually get enough distance between who we imagine we are as an image and the visuals around us. The second genus of dreamscape is more difficult to make discrete. Okay? So what William James said of religion may well apply much more generally, but projection is not, in fact, the whole story here. Okay? You remember that William James suggested that religion was a massive, even cosmic projection of the human ego onto what was a radical alien kind of space, right? The cosmos or nature, which has nothing really to do with humanity and its specific species concerns. However, if we say this, we also have to say that the meaning of this conjury, however venerable or yet institutional, the meaningfulness obtains through transference. The exemplar of religion may have its form as an egotistic projection, as William James has said, but its function lies in its ability to perform an egoistic transference, manifesting as society worshipping itself. This is, of course, one of Durkheim's famous epigrams. That is how he defined religion, society worshipping itself. We directly visualize in every such faith a version of ourselves, unlimited by our current and known conditions. It is an idealization of species in its other worldcraft. That's a kind of an interesting term to use, right? We're very familiar with worldcraft because we see that in all of our great fantasy epics, whether it's Star Trek or Star Wars, Harry Potter, or whomever it is. There's worldcraft there because we are placed in a world which is not, or not exactly, our own. But what about other worldcraft, right? The idea that we are conjuring something that is extra mundane, and that this too has a phantasmagorical element to it. And so this is an idealization of our own species, and it is the same of the person in its Godhead. So the idea of Godhead is in some ways an individuated idealization of this other worldcraft. Only the severely skeptical observer would stick to his projectionist guns in such cases. More holistically, we must begin to understand imagery as including the more profound transferential quality that stands in for us. It is what we would be if we could, who we should be if we are utterly honest with ourselves. Eventually, antique iconography gives way to the ineffable, precisely because this transference selfhood no longer needs an image of itself. The vehicle of transference has been overtaken in its very use, just as the old god of morals, to borrow from Nietzsche, died with his incarnation. In Islam, this transcendent reckoning of transference is taken to the furthest extent with its traditional ban on graven images. But we can see a gradual movement from projection to transference throughout the history of religious ideas. The earlier beliefs had many more images associated with them, the later ones, the less so. The earlier art is mimetic, the later more personalized and given to the individual artist's abilities and druthers. There remain formula renders, of course, and more than this, changes in political fashion and that style, as noted in the difference between the Roman images of Jesus, a clean-shaven, olive-skinned youth, and the later Byzantine ones, where we have more of a Christ-like figure perhaps, bearded, older, with lighter flesh tones. To dismiss imagery altogether is, of course, not to deny that one might still maintain a mind's eye picture of the divinity, or, at the least, the divine. As well, we would be advised to investigate the imagery of the cross-cultural dreamscape along these lines. Do Muslims encounter Allah in their nocturnal visions in the same way as do Christians meet Jesus? Indeed, perhaps the most earthy advertisements of a faith which still puts stock in imagery is that figures such as Jesus or this saint or that can appear in unexpected places, such as stains on appliances, bowls of cereal, and vintage burial shrouds, to name a few. I have not yet heard of a Muslim claiming that he witnessed the image of Allah in a local sand dune or such like. By this rubric, Islam can be considered a more advanced form of faith, and indeed it is, after all, the most recent major religion that has any cultural weight to it. Even so, the lack of visible visuals does not preclude the hermeneutics of imagery, for Islam too must comprehend its own religious architecture and the suasion of its shared beliefs. To do so, an image of what it means to lead both the good life and to approach the being whom Allah is supposed to be involves every believer in the work of interpretation. This as well as, along with all of the rest of us, that the Muslim retains her self-image, however wanting or faithful in relation to the divine, unseen but still visible to the soul's device. The imagery of dreams is then argued to be kindred with that of visions. Both cannot be shared in any direct manner. Both move us from the meaning of projection to the meaningfulness of transference. And perhaps of just as great import, both attend us when we are not fully conscious to mundane life. To this regard, the phenomenologist Alfred Schutz presents an image of perception which is particularly apt. The wide-awake world of the day-to-day is, for the social phenomenologist, the paramount reality. But there are certainly multiple realities, as they call them, and dreams and visions inhabit two distinct realities, not only from one another, but also from that of mundanity. That in folk cultures around the globe dreams were interpreted as visionary does not impinge upon this rubric. This is a quite distinct denotation from them being stated as themselves visions. No, the visionary is a mere attribute which might be present in many contexts, from works of art to political speeches, to aspects of philosophy, to this or that scientific theory. It functions along the lines of analogy, not homology, in that its metaphorical quality is light, and its form is similarly the stronger. The same may be said of the term dream. Even a good frozen yogurt can be like a dream, or the visual effects of a well-crafted video game akin to the dreamscape itself. Dreamy is not as acceptable a literary term as is visionary, but the point is, I think, made. We are apt to borrow the status of what we take to be rare, and indeed even enlightened, states of being, and apply them to the more benighted of our human experiences. We should at once remind ourselves of the value-neutral character of these realities which differ, sometimes radically, from mundanity. Hitler, too, was a visionary, and he, too, had a dream. Thus, imagery alone remains as vacant, and perhaps as vapid as does the Logos, when its pearls are strewn about in front of our somewhat swinish senses. Meaning is given almost as a given, for it comes from the tradition in question. But the question of meaningfulness in imagery can only be encountered and thence investigated through hermeneutics of the transferential, which in turn can perhaps be thought of as an important aspect of the hermeneutics of the subject, as Foucault has it, without the sense, of course, that this subject is objectified with the major purpose of subjection. especially subjection to the discourses. In a word, if we are to make meaningful the iconography, our analytical edge must be iconoclastic. The meanings are there, as it were, and if not always then, more or less already, there is a ready-to-wear sensibility about the wide-awake world, if you will, however fashionable or no, that cannot lead to meaningfulness, just as we are told that one's singular purpose cannot be derived from one's cultural birth in any direct manner. Another term, that of visualization, speaks to this disconnect in an imagic way. We are to, in our mind's eye no less, imagine a vista where our projects of action are completed, or at least are coming to fruition. The meditative version of this is putting oneself into one's happy place, if you will. The latter is about stasis and rejuvenation, but the former is about futurity, and whether or not the phenomenological purist demands that the social psychological vestments attached to Wesensschau, the intuition of essences, this is a term from Husserl, for instance, be immediately doffed, and nevertheless the sense of this intuition of essence is retained. We are beings who are ahead of ourselves, and this too is evidenced in an essential manner through not projection, which has as its goal the aggrandizement of the present alone, but rather through transference, which makes itself known through its imaginative what-if quality. In dreams, this work is done for us, as it were, by the unconscious itself. But it still falls to our waking consciousness to understand just what the dream has claimed it has accomplished on our behalves. And even the words heard within the dreamscape are images first. We are to apply firstly Saussure's y-axis, remember that from our series on text this time, in order to make them manage most of their metaphorical menagerie. We cannot afford to simply shrug them off as part of the strangest dream, or yet more commonly as having made no sense whatsoever. These are sort of commonplace things that we might tell ourselves upon awaking. Well, that was just a really strange dream, how stupid, or you know what, that didn't make any sense at all. Indeed, every dream has a sense about it, and however strange it may come across to the waking life, this is its language. This is how it has to get its point across. And the unconscious does give us the impression that it thinks that the conscious mind is a little bit dim, because the unconscious tends to use a sledgehammer to squash a fly, as it were. The dream, like the vision, is ever and itself the epitome of lucidity. It is we, rather, who are lacking in hermeneutic wit. This is yet another reason why we can suggest that dreams and visions present to us the language of the other world, as it was once refracted in myth. Okay? So here we have the image version, and even in our sense that we have to use our imagination, that root is there, the imagination, right? And then we imagine these visions, and we also are faced with the interpretation of visions when they occur to us somehow without our planning or without our imagination, and we are using that imagination in some other way. Okay. So that's just part 2. We're going to keep moving through here. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.